Hello, welcome to our workshop on how to be interviewed by the media. During lockdown, if you've been interviewed at all, it may well have been on Zoom or Skype as well as on the phone. But under normal circumstances, there are a whole range of contexts in which we can be interviewed. Of course, it could be radio or television or some digital outlet like a podcast. It could be live or recorded. It could be national or local. You could find yourself on a hard news programme or a news and current affairs programme. You could be in a radio studio with one man or one woman and their records where you kind of have a very chatty interview. It could be on a sofa in a morning television breakfast programme, which is generally much more relaxed. It's possible that you're interviewed for a documentary, which will have a different feel again and feel more fragmented. The great news is that in whatever context you're interviewed, the way to prepare is the same. And in the next 50 minutes, I'm going to teach you a cunning method for preparing for any kind of interview, which really works. What is it exactly that the interviewer is trying to do? Now, just a note here, of course, you could be being interviewed in a variety of different contexts. You could find yourself talking to the producer of a show. That would be very typical in radio and in some television outlets as well. You could be talking to a journalist who turns up with a camera crew or a microphone and recorder at your house or place of work. You could find yourself talking to the researcher on a documentary program, or you're in a studio chatting with a presenter. But I'm thinking particularly at the moment of giving some kind of newsy type interview. What is the interviewer trying to do? Now, the first job that they have is to get the facts straight. And I can imagine some of you rolling your eyes or staring at me in disbelief and going, no, that's the last thing they do. They try and distort you, they twist your words and so on. That's not what it's about at all. But actually, you know what? Regardless of an angle that a story might take or the bias that a particular outlet may have, actually, I've never yet met a journalist who's happy to get the facts wrong. And the reason for that is because it goes to credibility. Now, we all know there are those outlying examples where actually what purports to be a newspaper is no such thing, and it effectively makes stuff up. But for the main bulk of the news media, their credibility relies on the fact that they're reporting true facts. And there may be various processes going on where a journalist hands over material to an editor who cuts it down to size or makes it sound a bit more exciting. And therefore we start not to recognise what we've said. And I'll talk about this in a little while. But I have never yet come across a journalist who tries to get the facts wrong. One of the things that can really help you with this is to produce a fact sheet. Now, this is not a press release. If you work for an organisation that issues press releases to attract media attention, well, that's one thing. I'm talking about something else, which is if you were to prepare the basic facts about yourself and about your institution, about your subject, about the history of any particular problem that you're dealing with or addressing, then that could be very, very useful. It needs to be short. You do not put on that, these are the questions you need to ask me, because that's professionally insulting. No self-respecting journalist would ask you the questions that you told them to ask. But you could say, these are the issues, and very, very simply summarise those in as clear language as you possibly can. This is a really helpful thing to do. It's helpful for you, and it's helpful for the interviewer as well. And the chances are they'll get your name right, the name of your institution right, And of course, you'll be able to direct them more to the areas that you think are relevant and important and interesting in the field that you're working in the area that you're talking about. The next thing that an interviewer is trying to do is to clarify what you're saying, to untangle any knots. And of course, in an area which could be full of lots of jargon and technical terms, they'll be very, very keen to make what you're saying intelligible to the audience. A good interviewer will have in their mind a typical audience member, and they'll keep thinking to themselves, what exactly would my listener, my viewer, make of what's being said in this interview? And that's actually a very good tip for you as well as the interviewee, that when you are thinking about what you want to say, how would you say that to someone that you know who's reasonably intelligent, but who knows nothing about your research, perhaps has no background in your area, your field at all, but you want to communicate something? If you have a strong image of somebody like that you actually know, then you automatically affect your language, you change the way you say things and you phrase things and how much you think you can communicate over a short space of time. So these knots that I'm talking about that need to be untied arise quite often because we give too much information too quickly, or we give too little information so there's not enough context, or because we use jargon or acronyms, and that's so easy to do. You know, every single day you're talking to colleagues and you're using shorthand, and in fact what you and I are doing is we're using language that is understandable to a handful of people. And we've got into the habit of doing that, and they don't make any sense to anybody outside. So it's a little bit like talking a foreign language to people who don't understand that language. And also, there's a problem that sometimes arises because of assumed knowledge. We assume too much knowledge in the audience. And the job of the interviewer is to pick us up on that, just to slow us down sometimes. And they might say, well, look, let's just, before we go on, can I just go back and ask you to clarify such and such? Or what do you mean by such and such? Or what does that stand for? Or can you just explain that again? Because I'm not quite sure I completely understood it. And in that way, the interviewer is trying to get you to explain things in a way that their listener or their viewer can follow. So the next thing that a journalist is trying to do is find the conflict, because the essence of storytelling, including journalistic stories, is conflict. If you can find two people who are opposed to each other, the chances are you've got something interesting. If you can find frustration, irritation, different points of view, then from the sparks that come from that, you've got perhaps an interesting story. And of course, we ourselves get very irritated with journalists who try and find conflict in the wrong places, or try and find controversy where there isn't any controversy. And that, of course, is a very irritating issue indeed. But what I will say in terms of practical use for us is that when we go into interviews and there is a chance that there is a controversial area that will be stirred up, we really do need to know what our potential opponents would say about us, or are saying about us, and about our position. I've seen too many people go into studios completely convinced of the righteousness of their position, and they may feel very confident about that, but are often thrown because they didn't expect to hear a cogent argument from the other side. For now, just be aware that journalists will naturally be looking for conflict and for drama because they want to enrich their material as much as possible, and that's perfectly understandable. In fact, we can help them find drama in a way that is very useful to us, and I'll be talking about that shortly. Now, the other thing that journalists are trying to do is something which we don't talk about that much. I have to say, some of my heroes are journalists. Some of the people who most impressed me and inspired me are journalists. And I know there's a lot of poor journalism around in the world, and things not to be so proud of. But I think journalism has served us very well also, and it's produced some amazing characters. But one of the things that it's slightly difficult to talk about is this next thing which journalists need to do. Actually, anybody involved in production of media is trying to do. It's best if I approach this with an analogy. So this is a picture of a cat. And I am somebody, I like cats, I like animals in general. And I'm one of those people that if I'm out and about and I see a cat wandering around, I'll try and talk to it as long as it doesn't look too disease ridden or something like that, you know. And the thing that you notice about cats is that they behave in a very typical way. They tend to freeze and look at you as if you are the most shocking thing that they have ever seen. And then they'll relax and either saunter over to you or wander away contemptuously, or maybe if they're scaredy cats, they'll run away. Now, this may be a little bit strange, but I think, having tried various analogies to explain this to people, I think this is a perfect analogy for what the media is doing all day long. What it's doing is it's going, come over here, spend a little bit of time with me. It's trying to lure the audience. It's luring cats. And if you understand what I'm saying now, you understand everything that really matters about working with the media. Because the media isn't actually setting out to be against you, to trick you, to make you look foolish, to twist your words. It's not trying to do any of those things. The media is really mostly interested in luring cats. Now, of course, journalists and program makers and so on, want to have good content. They want to have the right content. They want people to think that it's worthwhile watching their programs. But the thing that obsesses program makers, from the journalists who are talking to interviewees through to the producers that make the programs, is that we want people to watch and to listen. We need audiences. We have to lure cats. And the reason why it's important for me to share this with you is because I very often meet academics who will say, well, look, what we deal with is, it's we use very precise language. You have to be very careful how you explain things, which I completely understand is true. And they will say, well, if the media really wants to talk to me about this, then they have to accept that this is difficult territory and that I need to lay out all the facts very, very carefully and so on. The problem for the media is that what they're hearing is boring, boring, boring. And the approach that I'm trying to encourage you to take is to become a co-worker with the media in luring cats. In other words, instead of seeing them as your enemy, see them as somebody who's just having to do a completely different job to you. And for you to think, how can you work together with them to lure those cats and to get your message across? If you can do that, then you will have done a very good thing for yourself, and you will have enabled your message to go that much further. So I promised a cunning plan to prepare for any kind of interview. And it's a 4-stage process with an overarching principle. And the overarching principle is this: go into an interview with something to say. Be proactive. Now, I'm anticipating some questions about that. Bear with me for a moment. I'll lay out this approach, and then hopefully I can pick up some questions shortly afterwards. Quite often if we are faced with interviews, the typical thing that we would do is, well, obviously make sure that we know our stuff, that we've got the facts that we need at our fingertips. But we're preparing for a situation where we don't know what the questions will be, so we may ask for them. But generally, journalists are trained not to give people specific questions. The reason for that is not sinister. It's not to trick you. It's because we want to encourage people not to learn answers so that we can have a conversation with people and it won't sound wooden. You know, you don't want people to say, well, I am glad you asked me that because the first point is blah and the second point is blah. You want something which is alive and dynamic, a conversation between people, because that's much more watchable. That helps to lure the cats. So a journalist will give you, of course, the general area of questioning. You know, why are they wanting to talk to you? What do they hope to get out of it? But probably not a list of the actual questions themselves. So what you are thrown back on is probably trying to guess the kinds of questions that you could be asked. Now, there's absolutely nothing wrong with this. You know, what sorts of questions do you reasonably think you might be asked? What kinds of questions would you ask? And you could sit up all night writing a long list of questions. It's actually not a bad exercise to try and get a few questions together and to try and answer them. The difficulty is that you'll be asked questions you can't predict, from an angle you can't predict, in an order that you can't predict. And so this approach is quite limited. So, of course, sharpening your mind, being clear about your material, just going over yourself, reminding yourself of certain data and so on, that's all good. But you need a more proactive approach. You need to go into an interview with this thought: how do I want to use this interview to communicate the most interesting and important things that I have to say about my field, about my area? What do I want the audience for this program to know about the work that I'm doing or the science that I'm doing? So we have a big overarching principle: be proactive, go into an interview with something to say. And I've got 4 processes that we can apply to that material then to start making it fit the interview context so much better. And the first one is to summarize your messages. Pick a message and think about how you could compress that down if you had to deliver it in a very short space of time. And of course, interviews are doing that all the while. If somebody shoves a microphone in your face and says, okay, we haven't got very long, but in essence, what is your research about? Then summarizing comes into play. The thing is that it's very easy to elaborate on something and incredibly hard on demand to compress something down. If I ask you to explain your research in 30 seconds, that's hard. If I ask you to elaborate on something that you've just said, that's much easier. So the idea of this part of the preparation is to take some time to think about the essence of what you want to communicate. In an interview, you can't say everything. If you tried, you would lose the attention of the audience. It's the nature of the medium. If you're going to do interviews at all, we have to make friends with that. We can't say everything, but we can say something. And if we say something well, very often we can get the opportunity to unpack that and elaborate on it, expand on it. So this is American sales training since the 30s, the elevator pitch. Imagine you're stuck in an elevator with somebody and you have just a few moments to sell them something. It's a horrifying thought, but you got the idea. What exactly would you say? And that gives you the essence of this summary idea. So one approach that works really well is a 3-sentence formula. The first one: is a context. You set the context of what it is that we're talking about. So, for example, your particular area of neuroscience. The second is the specific problem that you are dealing with. And the third is your particular response to that problem. If it's a research problem, what it is that you are doing in order to address that particular issue. So it's important to summarize. The next thing I want to encourage you to do is to prioritize your messages. You may have a list of 10 things that you want to say to the good people who are listening to or watching this particular program. But in news terms, you'll be incredibly lucky to be able to say more than 3 points. I mean, that's doing well if you can do that in an interview. And it follows that, therefore, you don't just want to talk about something just because you can. I often give interviews myself as well as interview people. One of the reasons I do it is because I'm involved with an international competition called FameLab. The idea of this is that it encourages early career scientists to communicate better with the public and to sharpen their communication skills. The challenge is for them to go out in front of quite often a large crowd of people, perhaps at a science festival or a special event for the competition, and wow a non-technical general audience with a talk about science in 3 minutes. The 3 minutes is very important, that it's concise. And you've probably seen competitions like this. If not FameLab, then a 3-minute thesis and things like it. So quite often, because I'm involved with the training, and I have been for many years in this, we have 33 countries around the world which from time to time take part in the competition. Not everyone does every year. I get to be interviewed. And I'm thinking of an occasion when I went to Bulgaria. A very good friend of mine, Bulgarian friend of mine, who's very well connected, got me a slot on national Bulgarian television, and via an interpreter, because I don't speak Bulgarian, was able to get me an interview. And my goal, my priority was that I wanted to say that the competition existed, that people were very welcome to come to it. And with half an eye to the audience, the academic audience that might be listening, I wanted to say how important it was that scientists communicated their science to the general public, and that people who were doing this should be encouraged and given time and, where possible, resources, and at least a certain amount of space in order to do this. Those were my objectives, that sort of thing. And the first question when it came via the interpreter was, do you think that science and religion will always be in conflict? Now, I wasn't expecting that question. And the interesting thing about it is that though it is completely irrelevant to what I was talking about, I myself am quite interested in the relationship between science and religion and society, particularly in the light of what's often called the new atheist debate and that kind of thing. So I've got a lot to say about it. But it would have been absolutely fatal for me in terms of my time and the squandering of opportunity if I'd gone down that road. Now, I know that you will be thinking now, but you can't just ignore the question. You're absolutely right. You can't just ignore the question. So how do you deal with it? Well, stay with me and I will explain in a little while how you deal with that. But at this point, I'm just concerned that you remember to prioritize, to think to yourself, come hell or high water, I am not leaving that interview without having made this point, and if I get the chance of making that point. If you stay aware of why you have come, then you can have some freedom to chat, some freedom to digress, but the vast amount of attention that you will give in the interview will be to the priority subjects that you have highlighted, the things that you want to use this interview for. So the third part of this process of preparing for an interview is to illustrate what we say. So this really is all about thinking in terms of story. By the way, I've done another workshop all about storytelling in this series, so you can find that, and of course you're welcome to look at that too. What I mean is this: that people who are successful as interviewees, in other words, people take some note of what they say, is they work in terms of story, they think in terms of story. Unfortunately for us, people are not sitting around the radio or the television with a notebook going, oh, that's a very, very interesting point that he makes there. So let's make a note of that and we'll talk about it later. Of course, that never happens. No one does that. We know this. Television and radio are kind of wallpaper for us. I mean, certainly the radio is on in the background while we're doing other things. That's how I treat it. And every now and again, I hear something and it sticks in my mind and I go, wow, that's interesting, that's striking. The same with television. Often in our household, television just burbles on in the background and we're having conversations over it. And then something will catch your attention and you stop and look at it. So we're familiar with this. There is no doubt that radio and television are both the kinds of media that desperately require a kind of storytelling skill to it. So what do I mean by that? Well, I mean being human. I mean recognizing that you can't ram information down the audience's throat, so it's paced. I mean that you think in terms of word pictures, that you're not afraid to be personal, you're not afraid to laugh or to express anger or dismay or whatever emotion is appropriate. You're not afraid to tell little stories and create word pictures. They can't be long, they can't be extensive. But people who think like that and talk like that are very effective as interviewees. You want an example of somebody, and please don't mistake this. I'm not saying everybody should be like this, but I love to watch someone like Neil deGrasse Tyson, for example, the American astrophysicist. I like watching him being interviewed because you see there his whole personality coming out, his passion comes out, and he's managing to talk about many important things and to give details that if it were done in any other way, as a series of sort of PowerPoint slides or a series of concepts that were being carefully explained, the audience just wouldn't buy it, whereas people listen in rapt attention. Now, we're all different. It's a big mistake to say, oh, let's all be like Neil deGrasse Tyson. But he's a good example of somebody who, using his personality, uses storytelling. And so use your personality to include a kind of storytelling mentality and bring that to your interviews. Find great metaphors, find great analogies. Incorporate anything you can that stimulates the imagination of the audience. So the fourth bit of this process is to think in terms of notable language. Now, we've kind of touched on that when we talk about storytelling and illustration, but I'm thinking of the hard work that's sometimes necessary to phrase something in such a way that it sticks in people's minds a little bit more. I mentioned Neil deGrasse Tyson just a few moments ago, and I recently watched an interview with him on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert in the United States. You may be familiar with it. And he was talking about the coronavirus. That's how they got into the interview in the first place. And obviously the first thing to say is, well, you know, I'm not a medical expert, not even a biologist of any sort. I'm an astrophysicist. And so that having been dealt with, he then talks about the coronavirus because sometimes it's very useful to give little caveats, you know, just to hedge around what you are an expert in, what you know a little bit about, what you know nothing about, and so on. That's okay. The audience is all right with that. And we are all right with that as long as we're not giving false impressions of our expertise and so on. And then he went on to say this: I think we're in an experiment, whether or not people will listen to scientists. And of course, for someone like me who's interested in the public engagement of science, that's great, and the audience applauded that. And that's really good news, because you understand the subtext is that he's putting the authority of science against the fanciful views sometimes of some politicians. Well, you can imagine a very different way of talking about that. You could have a very kind of serious sort of po-faced discussion about coronavirus. And we've all been having those kinds of discussions. But Neil deGrasse Tyson simply says, we're in the middle of an experiment. Now that is a nice, pithy, punchy phrase. We're in the middle of an experiment. And the second part of it is to see whether people will listen to scientists. And you have to think about that. There are so many more pedestrian ways you could express that idea, but that phrase sticks in the mind. So putting in the effort to think about the way we phrase things can be very powerful. So we go into our interview being proactive, with a proactive state of mind, having our own agenda. We want to use this interview in this particular way. After all, we know where the gold's buried. We know where the interesting stuff is, and the journalists may not know that. We understand our subject better than the person who is interviewing us, so it's a good idea that we're being proactive and that we have our own agenda in this interview. If we have our own agenda, it doesn't mean that we can't chat a little bit and respond a little bit to the questions that we're being asked. I'll come to that very shortly now. But it does mean that our minds will be very focused on what it is that we want to communicate through this interview. I'll let you into a secret, by the way. I do a lot of interviewing. I have a radio show where I interview scientists each week. One of the things that I dread is once we go live on air and I'm talking to some scientist about their research or something, or using them as a commentator on something. What's really difficult is if you find that you're asking questions as the interviewer and the person just gives you an answer and stops. That's really difficult. You have the sensation that you're pulling information out of your guest. That's really hard work. It's much nicer to interview somebody and you have to go, whoa, well, that's a lot of information. Let's just take that one piece at a time. We'll get to that, but let's just pick up on what you just said. And you're kind of managing this information that's pouring out. As an interviewer, I kind of go, thank goodness for that, because I know that this person has come with something to say, and that my job is to manage that, rather than to kind of extract from them some sort of interesting information. So let's imagine we've done the preparation along the lines that I've suggested, and now we come into the interview. You are now in the interview and the questions start to come. My best analogy for this is tennis. Play interview tennis. And in tennis, what happens is the ball comes towards you. It's a little bit hard on the computer screen for me. I'm usually on my feet waving my arms about when I do this. The ball comes over the net and we intercept it with our racket. And then what do we do in tennis? We knock the ball back when we need it to go. You knock the ball back where you want it to go. It's very same principle with doing an interview. The ball comes over the net, we intercept it with our racket. Now, what I mean by that, in my analogy, I mean answer the question. And people are often surprised when I say this. They expect that I'm going to say to them, don't answer the question. You may even have got that impression from some of the things that I was saying earlier, but I don't think that at all. It's extremely rare that any advisor would advise somebody not to answer the question. There are circumstances where that's probably the right thing to do, but I'm not encouraging people, for the most part, to do that. If you want, answers can be quite brief. Yes, no. I think about 50% of men and 49% of women. I actually don't know anything about that. That's not my area of expertise at all. You need to talk to one of my colleagues. All of those things are answers, and they can come to your aid when you need them. The principle is this: don't go on too much about something that you don't particularly want to talk about. The next step is absolutely crucial. In normal tennis, you intercept the ball with your racket and then you knock it back where you want it to go. And it's the same in playing interview tennis. So you might say, yes, I completely agree with you. But you know, the most important aspect of this is, and you knock the ball back where you want it to go. You might say, no, that's not the point that I'm trying to make at all. What I'm trying to say is, you knock the ball back where you want it to go. Or you might say 50% of men, 49% of women. But you know, the area that is of real interest here is knock the ball back where you want it to go. And so it goes on. I'm not an expert in this particular area. You'd need to talk to one of my colleagues. But what I can tell you is you've knocked the ball back where you want it to go. I hope you enjoyed my tennis racket hitting tennis ball sounds there. I've been practicing that for ages. The last thing that I want to share with you in terms of this process is another metaphor about driving, and I'll tell you the story. When I was 17 years old, my dad tried to teach me to drive. Now, in the UK, as many of you will know, it's entirely legal, although it's very mad, that a person with a driving license can have a learner driver sit with them and actually drive the car on the main road. This is separate from driving instructors. And my dad tried to teach me when I was 17 years old to drive a car. And the car, I was making the car weave all over the road, and it was absolutely terrifying for him and terrifying for me. And there was lots of shouting and screaming from my dad. And I think the lesson lasted about 10 minutes. He was absolutely terrified. So we saved up some money and we got a driving instructor. And I did the same to the driving instructor. But of course, being a driving instructor, he didn't freak out. And he just said to me, stop now. Your problem is that you're frightened of the car. And so you're only looking at the end of the hood of the bonnet of the car. And consequently, you're weaving all over the road. What you need to do is look up the road, say 100 yards or so, where you are going, and the car will straighten up. And he was absolutely right. That simple act of shifting my gaze from the vehicle itself to the distance changed everything. And now I drive around without driving onto the pavement or running people over perfectly successfully most days. It's the same with doing an interview. If you stay focused on the questions that you're being asked, you will be all over the road. If you stay focused on what you came to say, you'll drive a much straighter course. Now, that does not mean that you can't negotiate obstacles. And of course, if you are appropriately relaxed, then it's possible to have proper conversation with the interviewer. That always plays well, but you can remain absolutely focused on why you are giving this interview, the results that you want from the interview, to talk about your agenda. Now, normally you would expect a workshop all about how to be interviewed by the media to contain plenty of practice in how to be interviewed. And of course, in these constrained times, that's not possible. But I'm very grateful to this year's forum press volunteers, Shruti Mulida, Anders Jespersen and Harry Potter, because they agreed to be interviewed by me with very little instruction and with no knowledge of the questions that were going to come. And I'll give a little bit of feedback straight after this session. The questions aren't particularly challenging, but they didn't know what they were going to be. And perhaps there are one or two ways in which they could improve on their already perfectly good answers. I started off by asking Shruti to tell us just a little bit about her background.
So I'm a biologist by training, but I have been doing neuroscience for the better part of 10 years. I'm currently a postdoc at MIT, and I work on questions related to learning and memory.
So you're now involved with the FENS Forum. Why did you volunteer to get involved, especially at such a tricky time with having to do everything virtually?
I have always been very comfortable with doing things virtually, so for me it wasn't a very difficult decision. But I did want to specifically get involved with the press office, mainly because I have a personal interest in science communication, and I see the job of a press officer or helping out with duties such as this as sort of adding another facet to science communication. This is something I haven't done before. I am an independent science communicator, but I've never had a chance to see sort of behind the curtains of what goes on in a bigger conference or in a bigger event.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. Now, when you talk about science communication, you're talking about communicating to the public in general. We haven't much time for this, but why is that important?
It is very important because science is a publicly funded enterprise, and since it's funded by public money, the public deserves to know what science is doing, what is going on, what is good, what is bad, and all the results that come out of all the science that we as scientists do.
Very cogent answer. Thank you very much indeed. Anders, let me come to you now. Tell us a little bit about your background. What kind of a scientist are you? A very good one, I take it. But what is it that you're doing?
So I'm doing a PhD at the moment at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, so the neighbouring city to where FENS should have been this year. I am looking at links between the areas that we live in, the sort of the quality of life we have, and the risk of getting depression. And basically, I'm looking at sort of cohort data, large data sets, so it's very much computer based rather than a wet lab situation.
Okay, and why are you involved with the FENS Forum? I mean, we're all very glad that you are, but why did you volunteer to take part with the press office and so on?
So I was involved with the FENS Forum in 2018 as a Twitter ambassador, and I thought that it was a really interesting experience. I learned a lot, and basically I saw that the FENS Forum were looking for volunteers to work in the press office, and I thought that would be a brilliant way of getting even more involved with the FENS organization. So, and I've always, for quite a few years now, I've done various bits of public engagement and science communication work, and I thought this was something, this was an angle that I hadn't worked at before, basically.
Okay, well, we're going to leave it there. Thanks very much for talking to us, Anders.
Cheers.
And finally, I want to come to Harry. So same question to you, Harry, really, is what is it that you do? What's your day job?
So I'm a biomedical scientist by training, and I'm now in the final year of my PhD at the University of Manchester. And the research that I'm interested in is all around how stress that we experience in our early life, so before we're born, and in our childhood, can affect our risk for developing psychiatric disorders in later life. Okay,
and you have volunteered to be part of the FENS Forum. You're helping to put this conference on. What's your role, and why did you get involved with it?
So my role is a voluntary press office assistant. So that's working with the press office and the FENS communication committee to disseminate the work that's presented at FENS to the public and to the scientific community. The main reason I wanted to get involved is kind of similar to the other two here, is that I've worked for the British Neuroscience Association, so the kind of national society, doing a very similar role using social media to talk about neuroscience, and I just kind of want to expand that onto a more international platform.
Okay, thank you very much. And when you talk about expanding it, why is that important?
I think because science is obviously how we understand the world, and it ultimately leads to new treatments and new understanding of disorders. And so the public kind of deserve to know about that and to know where the next steps are being taken.
Okay. Harry, thanks very much.
Thank you.
So big thanks to Harry, Shruti and Anders there. Of course, they did perfectly well in that interview. It was a fairly gentle interview, a fairly gentle piece of practice. And all I would say to them, it's not entirely fair because I dropped this on them, but what I would say to them is that you could see immediately the difference having an agenda would make. Because if you went in there, instead of thinking, what are the questions that he's going to ask me, but thinking, what is it that I want to communicate through this interview, there would be an eagerness and there would be a moving from the answer that you give, a brief response to what you're being asked, to doing whatever you can to take it to where you need to go. I'm always saying to people when I give feedback, don't be so polite, in the sense that I don't encourage ever people to be rude in interviews, but don't think that it's a deferential situation where the interviewer asks a question, then you answer it, then you get another question, so you answer it. It's much better to have a conversation in which the interviewee is being proactive. Beyond that, anything you can do to make the conversation less abstract and more concrete, the better. The more you can speak in sort of concrete terms, put word pictures into people's minds, things that they can identify, examples, metaphors, analogies that help people get hold of what you're saying, examples from personal experience and so on. Don't be afraid of emotion when it's appropriate and in its right place. And of course, think of vivid language. I don't mean your whole conversation has to be full of extraordinarily vivid and graphic words. What I am saying is that if you can find some well-put phrases, if you can express your ideas more vividly, then it all goes to help people remember and take note of what it is that you're saying. Beyond this, what we have to do is practice. It's hard being interviewed because suddenly you have to reorder your thoughts in a way that you weren't expecting. But this method that I've taught you, I think will take you a very long way. If you can find someone who can ask you questions you can't predict, in an order you can't predict, from an angle you can't predict, it's the very best preparation I can think of for getting ready for an interview. And I hope that this introduction to how to be interviewed by the media has put you in good stead. Happy interviewing.